Clearly, one of the big narratives in the business landscape today is the notion of belonging, actually. So I think organizations are doing a few things at the same time. Obviously, the history is one of diversity, and that's really about representation. So we want people that are historically marginalized to be represented within our corporate structures and within leadership. And then we've kind of leveraged up from diversity to inclusion, and that's making sure that people that are different have a voice, and so that they are respected, they've got a voice at the table, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have this conversation about belonging, and I'm often asked, Dan, what does belonging mean to you? And for me, I guess it's about a feeling. It's not necessarily an intellectual standpoint, but belonging is about saying, is this a community that I want to be part of? Do I feel a sense of belonging? Do I feel a sense of warmness, respect? Do I feel that people understand who I am, where I'm coming from, and that we can all kind of, groove in the same space? And I think for me, there's also a connection between belonging and cohesion, actually, because when we think about belonging in our communities and in our neighborhoods, can we hang out on our street corners and be our authentic selves without fear of judgment or discrimination or exclusion or covering? And I think those principles that we apply within a community setting equally apply within the corporate landscape. So can I come into work and be who I am with that strong sense of community and psychological safety? So for me, belonging is fundamentally connected to notions, yes, of psychological safety, but much more feelings of community and, space to be who I want to be in that moment. There's going to be much more of a spotlight on the relationship between well-being and inclusion at work. So if that is the case, we need to be forensic in our analysis of what creates stress and pressure points in organizations. So we know that there are a number of dimensions and factors around that. One of the greatest ones that we are seeing more of is the idea of what we call employee kind of loneliness. And I think that plays out in two ways, particularly from a D&I perspective. Because of the external noise in the marketplace and external pressure, D&I professionals and allies are feeling more lonely within this space. And so we don't have that kind of emotional support network around us. So the loneliness factor is one that we are particularly concerned around at Fairness. That doubles up in terms of the kind of what we call the burden of representation. So women, people of colour, members of the LGBTQ community, etc. We are now carrying the agenda ourselves because we're seeing a strategic silence or withdrawal from traditional allies and supporters. So what comes with that is this greater emotional tax that we're having to carry together with that burden of representation. And of course, what that creates is emotional stress, trauma, etc. I think the other thing that we are seeing is more of a kind of a slight toxicity around the conversation because of the D&I backlash and a kind of a fundamental kind of lack of respect in terms of what we do. So I think as a whole, the loneliness, the emotional tax, the lack of respect, the toxicity within our cultures adds up to a greater set of ingredients which leads to mental ill health as opposed to well-being and the rest of it. So it's really important that organisations put frameworks in place to support not just diverse and inclusion professionals, but wider stakeholders from diverse communities as well. And that is things like a zero tolerance on what we see as increasing kind of hate speech within organisational cultures. Making sure that networks, so ERGs are there as support networks, as well as strategic networks for diverse colleagues, etc. Making sure we have robust policies and processes around the boundaries between in-work conversations and out-work experiences, etc. So we would expect organisations to be much more strategic in terms of this conversation, but also the support mechanisms that are being built and should be built around the well-being for D&I professionals, but for diversity and inclusion or diverse colleagues as a whole. These days I often talk to our clients around the relationship between inclusion and well-being at work. And I think that's becoming much more mainstream as a topic. And I think there's a number of ways to reflect on this. One is what I would call a structural response, and the second would be a psychological response. So we do know from a psychological perspective, if you can't be yourself at work, if you hide who you are, if you cover, etc., that causes psychological trauma. So that clearly has an impact in terms of mental health, well-being, etc. But we also know there's a structural reason. So the 24/7 use of technology, the lack of flexible working policies, the kind of always on culture, those sorts of things compound long hours. And we do know that there's data that says if employees work 55 hours per week or more, it's more likely to have a negative impact in terms of heart attacks, stress, etc., etc. So a physiological impact. So what organizations need to do is they need to do two strategic things at the same time. They need to look at their working patterns and processes. So do they have flexible working in place? Are they mindful of long hours culture? Do they regulate the use of technology? And all of that stuff is a positive in terms of effectively work-life balance, or what we might call work-life integration these days. The second thing, though, about well-being is we need that structural stuff in place, but we need the psychological dynamics at the same time. So we need high levels of psychological safety and belonging. And once we get those ingredients aligned with the alignment of technology, policies, processes, mitigation of toxic work cultures, all of that stuff, that's where we start to see an uptake in well-being. We know that when people feel a sense of well-being, organizations get stuff from that. So we get much higher levels of motivation, engagement, individual performance, team performance, and organizational profit and the rest of it. So we don't want to see well-being as a soft topic. We know that when we align inclusion and well-being, there's a whole bunch of benefits from that effectively.